To define postmodernism in simplest terms would be a rejection or skepticism towards the meta-narratives of modernism. But what is postmodernism really about? Modernism was more of a movement in respects to the arts than in philosophy, but postmodernism has a special philosophical attachment to it. Most postmodern philosophers reject old theories in philosophy that sought absolute or universal answers to problems in ethics. So postmodern truth in ethics is not based upon these universal or unchanging principles, but are rather based upon atheism, naturalism, and evolution. This abandonment of objective truths is nothing new of the sort. Most postmodernists believe that the ultimate authority for ethics and truth is largely left to the individual. This idea can be seen in Kant's Copernican revolution. Kant's Copernican revolution, as he puts it, is the perception that makes the object possible, rather than the object that makes perception possible. This changes the human mind from being a passive, perceptive entity to an active originator of experience. But if people are the originators of perception, then what of objective science, such as the motions of planets or theories of numbers? To this, postmodernists often cite Nietzsche's hypothesis that scientific concepts are chains of metaphors hardened into accepted truths. To use the example Nietzsche himself provided, imagine a person who is completely deaf and has never had the sensation of sound, and one day sees sand vibrate and deduces the cause to be the plucking of strings. He then declares that he must know that this is what people call sound. That, Nietzsche says, is the situation of all of us with language. When we speak of things such as trees, flowers, or mammals, we believe that we have knowledge of these things, but what we really have are metaphors of things which do not correspond with the actual entities. But then you might be asking, if all truth is subjective to the individual, then why should we concern ourselves with things such as ethics or science? Well, postmodernists aren't completely comfortable with abandoning these things yet. Now, for ethics, they have tried to come up with a solution to these problems. And one idea they have come up with is the one of little narratives. That is, the idea that if philosophical truth can be found within a community, then moral truth can as well. This is what philosopher Richard Rorty has tried to come up with as an answer to this difficult question. This idea that each community has the ability to create its own moral and ethical principles leads to a type of cultural relativism, but Rorty is hesitant to use this term because of its implication that every ethical standard is as good as another. For example, comparing Nazi ideology to the typical American's beliefs would mean that in this system, neither is right or wrong, because there is no standard to measure right or wrong. But Rorty will still say that his ethics are superior to those of the Nazis. But while making this claim, he also admits that there's no way to judge between the two views. To put it simply, for postmodernists with Rorty's outlook, the members of a particular community govern the morality of its members. This is identical to the thoughts that Nietzsche had when considering a secular society and morality, that society as a whole would decide what is morally right and wrong, and that any change in morality can be seen as a change in society. It is worthwhile to note that not all postmodernists agree with Rorty's analysis. Adam Phillips, a postmodern psychologist, when confronted with Rorty's assessment, remarked that ethical standards are a form of pontification and imperial self-aggrandizement. No adult can know what's best for another adult, and by the same token, no group or society can know what's best for another group or society. But what happens when postmodern ethics, where the individual reigns supreme, is applied to reality? For this, the best example can be found in Theodore Dalrymple's Life at the Bottom, the worldview that makes the underclass. In this, Dalrymple sees the reality that those in the 20th century who sought to liberate our sexual relations all moral, social, or contractual obligations and meaning, so that only raw sexual desire itself would count in our decision-making. In this, he remarks, if anybody wants to see what sexual relations are like freed of contractual and social obligations, let them look to the lives of members of the underclass. Here, abortions are procured via abdominal kung fu, children who have children in numbers unknown before the advent of chemical contraception and sex education, women abandoned by the father of their child a month before or a month after delivery, insensate jealousy, the reverse of the coin of general promiscuity, that results in the most hideous oppression and violence, serial stepfatherhood that leads to sexual and physical abuse of children on a mass scale, and every kind of loosening the distinction between the sexually permissible and the impermissible. But what of scientific truth as well? Well, postmodernists, in the belief that there is no universal truth, will say that the epistemology of science, or how knowledge is differentiated between justifiable truth and opinion, is deceitful because it is exclusionary to certain viewpoints. In his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn gives some weight to the argument of science deniers by saying, if science is not a gradual process of accumulation of knowledge, but rather subject to sudden revolutions that overwhelm outdated theories, they argue, how can one trust scientific knowledge? This distrust of established science and how knowledge is procured is problematic, to say the least, when people challenge scientific authority. A good example of this is GMOs. The idea of GMOs being harmful to the environment mainly came from opposition to biotechnology from some environmentalists and agricultural groups. While they did at first raise legitimate concerns about the use of GMOs, they soon shifted to an ideology of opposition, as science had demonstrated that such risks are often small and specifically not related to GMOs. Given the lack of scientific evidence to support their claims, they began attacking the risk analysis of GM crops. Scientific authorities are not only questioned on the quality and validity of their experts, but also on the scientific method and its universality. Postmodernists want all scientific views to be considered equally when it comes to problems such as these. Sometimes they question whether or not scientific research is needed as well. Postmodernists also have a progress-halting approach when it comes to biology, psychology, and sociology, where they borrow heavily from Pinker's blank slate theory, which fits in to their meta-narrative of a universe built completely on the perception of the individual. So where does this leave postmodernism? That is a question that very few postmodernist philosophers can answer. Pre-modernists based their ideas of science and the world on tribal knowledge of God and superstition. After the Enlightenment, people sought to shake off these superstitions of the past to achieve even greater progress, and sometime in the mid-20th century, people inspired by Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud sought even greater freedom from presupposed universal truths. From the problems of capital to the state of man as he relates to the world of endless commodities. And until they can come up with a solid groundwork for the ideas, their modes of thought will probably never be fully realized in modern science as it is today, as doing so would greatly halt the progress that we have achieved thus far.